Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video we're going to do three main things. First, we're going to add some logic to our vote route that's going to query the database to get the comic whenever a request is received. In order to do that, we're going to have to pass the comic ID from EJS to our JavaScript so that we can send that request. And then finally, we're going to use that ID in the request body that we send. So first, let's go ahead and just update the route. So here inside of comics, scroll down until we find the vote route. Here it is. We can go ahead and get rid of this console.log the body. Actually, no, let's not. Let's leave that for now. Request body. Let's label it even to make it a little bit more clear. And then let's talk about what we want our request body to look like. Basically, we want it to be an object with two properties. Comic ID is going to be something like ABC123, you know, the big old long comic object IDs. And then we want it to be vote type. And this is going to be either up or down. Let's comment this out so we can have it to look at. So that is what our we want our request to look like. So we can go ahead and query the database. In order to do that, we're going to turn this into an async function so that we can use await. Const comic equals await comic.findById, and the ID we're looking for is request.body.comicID. Even though this is not working yet, that's what we're looking for. And whenever we find it, let's just console.log that comic. Just so we can know that, hey, it worked, here's the comic that it found. And in fact, instead of sending back JSON of the message voted, let's just send comic. Let's just send that whole comic back as JSON. So we can't really test this yet because our current functionality does not have this schema. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and come in here to comic show and update that. Fortunately, this is pretty simple to update. So right now, the body just has one thing in it. JSON.stringify one thing right here, this votes.up. We want this to be two things. So let's go ahead and break this out onto those lines. We want the vote to be up, and we want the comic ID. Now, right now, we don't have access to this, but we're going to handle that in the very next step. But what this is going to do is it's going to now change that to vote up and comic ID, and I think we called it vote type, didn't we? Yeah. So let's change this instead of just vote to vote type. And the same thing down here. Vote type is going to be down and comic ID. Remember, this is the same as doing that. ES6 lets us shorthand it. So there's that. And then the last thing we have to do is figure out how we are going to get JavaScript variables from our database, the comic ID right here, because whenever this page, the show page is loaded, we're passing in the comic ID. We're passing the comic, rather, to that render call, but that is only passed in to the EJS template. That's not actually passed into the front end. So if I look in here in the console for comic, doesn't exist. Comic is not passed to our JavaScript. It's just passed to the EJS and used in the EJS. So what we have to do is come into our show page, comic show.ejs, and pass that in. So I'm going to do it down at the bottom right before comic show.ejs because we want this to run before, and we're just going to pass it in as a script. Script. I'm just going to do var comic ID is equal to, and this has to be in a string, EJS tags. Notice that it's the hyphen, not the equal sign, comic dot underscore ID. What this is doing is as soon as the page loads, it gets down to this part, it runs this JavaScript. It runs variable comic ID is equal to this string. And then this runs, which means that because this is running first, this now has access to it. So if I save this, no daemon, it's running, let's refresh my page, and now let's try and run comic ID. And you can see that it is indeed in the JavaScript. I can see the comic ID now. So that should make everything work. That should make that work, which should make this work. So let's go ahead and log in and test it. Let's hit plus. There we are. We're getting the comic. We got the actual comic back. It tells you the owner, the color, the date, all the information about that comic. What that tells me is that this vote route is running properly. It is querying the database, and you can see right here that we're actually constant logging that comic. We got the request body right here. Vote type is up. Comic ID is there, which is exactly what it's supposed to be. So this ran, works correctly, and now we got all of the comic information. That is wonderful. So the last thing we have to do, as always, we have to update our Git. So git add public /js/comics show. And what we did inside of here is we can actually just do this for all of them. Git add all, and then git commit update vote query to include comic ._id. That probably shouldn't have been query. That probably should have been request or something. But anyway, git push origin master. In this video, we did three main things. First, we updated our vote route so that we got the correct comic based on the passed in comic from the request. Then we updated our comic show.ejs in order to pass in that variable, to set that variable so that we have access to it in our JavaScript. And then finally, we updated our send vote function here to incorporate that information into the request that it sends. And all of that worked together to basically include the comic information into the request so that our backend knows what to do with it. In the next video, we're going to be updating this route pretty drastically in order to actually use this information to make changes to the database, to actually tally the votes, if you will. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll be happy to help. Thanks.